Good evening and welcome back to the Rewatch. You got Max here, George from the Unqualified Filmbros podcast. We are breaking down every single MCU project leading up to Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Today we're going to be talking about Thor, and without further ado, let's get into it. George, what do you think?
It's a good start for the characters of Thor's world. And I'm not talking about Asgard here. I'm not talking about New Mexico. I'm talking about his sphere. Thor, Loki, Odin, Frigga, Sif, the Warriors 3, Jane Foster, Eric Selvig, Darcy Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
His core, at least for his first two movies, you count the Avengers in that, you wouldn't for his solo film purposes. But it's a good enough start. And I think Chris Hemsworth plays the arrogance of the young, reckless king in waiting that I think drives his character for much of the first two acts of the film. You get a little bit more of the hero as it goes on. There are some scenes that I don't think really fit that characterization of him. But the story, I think, is a really, really strong way in terms of putting together a superhero movie to present the character of Thor and his cohort to the audience of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah, no real qualms there. I mean, I am curious as to what one of those scenes, maybe two of those scenes are that didn't quite fit the characterization.
Yeah, so when I was rewatching this before we started here, I really just didn't get the scene where he and Selvig go to a bar and get drunk. Like, it's funny, it shows some of the lighthearted nature of the characters, but at the same time, it's like there's this whole conflict going on, everything that's happened in the lead up to this moment, and you're going out and having a drinking contest. So I feel like that scene, I said scenes, but that scene really stuck out to me the most as just a glaring pacing issue. And it really feels out of character for the two of them to this point in the film.
So, I think you raise an interesting point of like, yeah, it kind of falls into that movie cliche of there's all this stuff going around you, and then the characters stop and have a moment, right? It happens in so many movies. I'm not even
So
gonna
many
try.
movies and so many superhero movies.
Lots of superhero movies where like middle of the action, stop to explain something, stop to do something dumb or do something so out of place for the moment.
And
but
not even stopping in an action sequence, like taking a whole 3 or 4 minute scene where it just slows to a stop.
Yeah.
And we see that a couple of times in the MCU, mostly in the earlier films.
Yeah.
We've talked about it in the first couple episodes of the rewatch, but also, it's something that exists to this day in the MCU.
Yeah,
those scenes are still there.
Does. Yeah. To be honest, that didn't quite stand out to me in the same way that it did for you. I think part of that reason is one, to that point in the movie, we had gotten that characterization of Thor as a party bro. He loves to drink. He loves to have.
Save that for when we talk about What If.
He has lots of fun with his friends, drinking beer and eating good food. I think it was probably most out of character for Selvig, and yet it still kind of fit for me just because they'd just gotten out of a high stress situation where Thor was incarcerated by Agent Coulson and the other agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And, I think it kind of worked. I think it might have been a little bit too long, but I think the scene itself presented a nice bridge into what happened next. But anyways, not the most important part, but it's very interesting to hear your thoughts on that. I think it was overall like a pretty well made film. Like it looks good. Asgard is gorgeous, as it always is in every appearance that it makes across the MCU. But I mean, this is our introduction to something outside of, um,
Earth.
Earth. um, and it had to be grand. It had to be over the top. It absolutely was, but in the best ways. I think the gold really elevated that. You had Frigga and Odin delivering great performances. Well, not them, but the actors playing them, and
Rene Russo and Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah, Rene Russo and Anthony Hopkins. I know them. But it was a really great introduction to a fantastic character. Kenneth Branagh, I think, did an excellent job with what he was trying to do.
Yeah, props to Kenneth Branagh for telling this story. He has a really, really strong range as a director because he can make this story work. He can make, murder mysteries work. We've seen with Murder on the Orient Express, with Death on the Nile. He can be an Oscar nominee for Belfast.
Yep.
So the guy is a very talented director. I think he does a good job with this film. Take or leave the Dutch angles that he uses for about 30% of his shots. Yeah, I mean, behind the scenes, Branagh's great. MVP has to be Patrick Doyle. This score is just sublime. I find no fault with it. I'm a huge movie score buff. We both are. But yeah, I just wanted to shout out my guy Patrick Doyle.
No, I mean that's something I think we should spend a little bit more time on. We haven't really talked about the music and the MCU to this point. Iron Man,
that's for good reason
music.
With the first 3 films.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing really that stands out in any of the 3 first films, but this is the first film where the score doesn't take center stage, but it plays a massive part in moving the story along and helping us understand, or helping us feel the emotions and feel the weight of what the characters are feeling. And that's what a good score does.
The quality of this score, the fact that we are highlighting it so much right now, it's the first time we've really, and there are themes for Iron Man and Hulk that we've gotten in the first 3 films, but this is the first time that you can really identify a character theme, which is so important for developing a film of this scale, where I think the music enhances and amplifies what's happening to Thor throughout the film. You get the introduction to Asgard, you get the transition to when he's got his power stripped and banished to Earth. You've got when he becomes worthy again. The way that Patrick Doyle brings together so many musical elements in the presentation of this character throughout his arc, while still carrying that theme, is just it's not something I think a lesser composer could accomplish.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's an interesting introduction to the character. A very fascinating way to examine the way a king might, or like a king in waiting might, and sort of subverting those expectations of, he's grown up in the shadow of the throne his entire life. You might think that there would be some decorum, there'd be some readiness
Restraint.
for the throne. Yeah, restraint. But you get none of that. And I think that's really interesting. You have Loki, on the other hand, as cool and collected as they come when it comes to, a royal. And he's slick, but Thor is the one taking
slick
up
like
all
ice.
this. Yep. He's taking up all the space, all the attention, and as a king in waiting probably should, but in the wrong ways, causing all sorts of damage and destruction, causing problems.
Yeah, I think that this version of Thor, it is our first glimpse at the character, but this version of Thor isn't Thor at his best. I think is the bottom line, in that he's grown, not just over the course of the movie, but over the course of the MCU. You know, you talk about Thor in this movie, in the Avengers, in the Dark World, and then a little bit in Age of Ultron, and then you talk about the Thor that we've had recently with Ragnarok, Infinity War, Endgame, and it's almost like two different characters, but Hemsworth has such a way of bringing that arc across that you see how the character changes. And I think, like I was just saying, this isn't the best version of Thor, but it's a great start.
Absolutely. And speaking of restraint, we're gonna have to refrain from talking about the really wonderful arc that this character takes. And so, as to your point, Chris Hemsworth deserves a lot of credit for that. I think you're right. Almost two different characters, starting around Ragnarok. Right, it's a completely different vibe of a film, which we'll obviously get to. But any closing thoughts before we get into rankings and ratings?
It would have been very different if Tom Hiddleston had gotten the role that he had auditioned for as Thor. He gives a great performance. He's the MVP of every project he's been in. It's not my favorite Thor film. It's not my favorite MCU film, but it's always at least an enjoyable part of the MCU.
Yeah.
And Jane Foster's coming back this summer.
She is. Triumphant return to the big screen in a big way, not just a cameo. Well, so my final thoughts before I throw it over to you for ratings. I think something that's great about phase one is that it is inconsistent. It is imperfect, but those are the characters that we're getting. We're not getting these polished superheroes that are people that we can just say, oh, I want to be like them, or I want my kids to be like them, or I want people around me to behave like them. No, they're people that are not necessarily the best. They're characters that aren't necessarily role models, and that's okay, because they built the groundwork. The MCU built the groundwork, and they said, okay, just give us some time, and they fleshed them out so much over the course of 32 projects, and whatever character arcs that these characters have taken.
And whatever character arcs are to come.
And whatever character arcs are to come. Well said. To wrap this up, George, you want to give us your rating and ranking of the MCU?
Yeah. I think Thor, while it is a stronger entry in phase one, is not the strongest in phase one. Definitely more enjoyable than the last two projects we've talked about over the last couple of episodes. But I am going to toss it a 72 out of 100. I think it has its flaws. They're noticeable. But on the whole, the positives outweigh the negatives. And I think that score reflects that. As for my MCU rating, we've said it a lot during phase one, a testament to the projects that were to come. I will rank it 25th out of the 32 projects.
Yeah, we're going to be similar again. Almost identical for the ranking out of the MCU. I have it at 26. It is a weaker project. No matter what I said about it being a great introduction to the character and Asgard and all that stuff, that all is true, but it just didn't quite move the needle in a lot of ways for me. And so because of that, I'm going to give it a 74 out of 100. Pretty weak score, but definitely passing grade, definitely a solid entry into the MCU. So that's going to do it for us tonight. We will be back with you tomorrow talking about Captain America, the First Avenger. I know we're all excited about that. So good night.